Hello Booktube, I'm Scott. Welcome to Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. And today I'm going to do a review and discussion of the book Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of the synopsis, and I want to talk about some of the techniques that Emily Bronte uses, and then I want to answer two questions about this book at the end. I want to discuss whether this is a love story, and I want to discuss the question whether Heathcliff is black. So let's kick off with a little bit of a synopsis, a little bit of background rather. This was written in the year 1847 by Emily Bronte under the pseudonym Alice Bell. The second edition was revised by Charlotte Bronte in the year 1850, 3 years after it was published, but in the meantime Emily had unfortunately passed away. So Charlotte did the revise. She sort of just watered down some of the accents to make them more easily understood and fixed some punctuation and spelling errors. This book takes place in the year 1801, but most of that is being remembered, recounted, retold, and it takes place earlier than that. It details two families, one living at Wuthering Heights, the Earnshaws, and their two children, Hindley and Catherine, and one living at Thrushcross Grange, the Lintons, and their two children, Edgar and Isabel. One day, Mr. Earnshaw has to go to Liverpool on business and brings back a child who is called Heathcliff. The child was looking like he was going to die, and Mr. Earnshaw brings him back and ends up preferring him to any of his other children. Heathcliff and Catherine develop a friendship which becomes a love. From then, the story develops. It goes into a second generation after Heathcliff, Cathy, and all of the rest. But I will not go too much into the storyline in case you haven't read it. I will bring up some of the literary techniques used here by Emily Bronte. These literary techniques are fascinating because Wuthering Heights is really a love it or hate it novel, and I think it's these techniques that actually make it so popular and so hated at the same time. And there are two in particular that stand out. Firstly, the unreliable narrators. This book is narrated by Mr. Lockwood, but Mr. Lockwood's not telling most of the story. Actually, most of the story is told by Nellie Dean or Alan Dean, but it's actually Mr. Lockwood telling you the whole story, and he is telling you Nellie's story. And then at another point we also have a section from Isabel who writes a letter. So we have this sort of nested narrative where sometimes we have Lockwood, but actually we have Nellie through Mr. Lockwood, and then sometimes we have Isabel through Mr. Lockwood as well. So it's a nested narrative, and it's very clear that Mr. Lockwood doesn't like Heathcliff. It's very clear that Alan doesn't like Heathcliff. In fact, it's very clear that these characters are wound up in the stories and have their own interests. And thus we have this, not just an unreliable narrator, but a nested unreliable narrator. You almost need to you could even analyze the relationship between Nellie Dean and Mr. Lockwood to see if Mr. Lockwood is exaggerating what Nellie Dean is saying. In fact, some of Nellie Dean's actions don't seem to match what her feelings are in the novel. In fact, she's often helping Heathcliff at points when she clearly despises him. At other points, she is completely hindering him as well. But it's a very complicated relationship they have, and you wonder if that's the unreliable narrator or if that's actually how complicated it is, and almost certainly it's both. The other literary technique that Emily Bronte uses that is frustrating to anybody who has ever read this book is the second generation of people have the same names as the first generation. While this lets Emily Bronte say so much about the novel and hint at so many things, and whenever she is using Catherine to say stuff, Catherine Junior to say stuff, she's actually speaking for both her and Catherine Senior, or by repeating the names. But at the same point, that's really confusing. And there was a point in this novel where a character dies, and I was like, is that the older or the younger? And then as this narrative then sort of tells you what happens and then goes back, then the character that you think has just died is then back in the story, and it is just a very confusing novel in that sense. But the things that make it confusing make it excellent. Lastly, and I didn't plan to talk about this, but the thing that really does make it a love it or hate it novel is that the characters in here are quite insufferably horrible to one another. They're just not particularly nice people at all. And I can tell you my personal experience. I really didn't enjoy the narrator. I didn't enjoy Nellie Dean, and there's a scene in it where Nellie Dean gets slapped by Catherine, and I just kept reminding myself that happened because I just hated Nellie Dean so much when I was reading it, because she's biased and she's manipulating. But to be honest, so is everybody in this book. You shouldn't be liking characters in this book, essentially. Every character, even Nellie Dean's narrative and Mr. Lockwood's narratives, are so biased towards Heathcliff that it makes you wonder whether Heathcliff is a good character. But actually, Heathcliff is completely an asshole, and the narratives that he's given just make him more so. And so this makes it like a real love it, hate it book. And for me personally, the first time I read this book, I hated it, and the second time I read this book, I really enjoyed it. So, I can definitely relate to having the two different experiences. A lot of people say this is a love story, and I find that a little bit of an incredulous statement. This is, if anything, a hate story. This is a hate story. It is full of spite and revenge. But there are some lovely lines in it. The relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff, or Catherine and Heathcliff, is very flowery. And there are some quotes in here. I'm just going to read you some quotes. Excuse me if I'm looking at my phone, because I've just written them down because I don't have a brain to remember a lot of things. This is Catherine talking about Heathcliff. He's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. And then this one, which I think is a better but longer quote. If all else perishes and he remains, I should still continue to be. And if all else remains and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger place. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it. I'm well aware as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's always, always in my mind, not as a pleasure any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So we can see that Catherine definitely has feelings towards Heathcliff here, but even in these words, we can sort of see that there is an obsession here, like the world wouldn't make sense without him if he were a knight. Like she's describing her love for Heathcliff by what if he wasn't there, like how much I would miss him, but not how much the world wouldn't make sense to me. It's not a lover's emotion. It's like it's an obsession, and this is backed up by Heathcliff. So this is another quote from the novel. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. I believe, I know that ghosts have wandered the earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in the abyss where I cannot find you. O God, It is unutterable. Oh God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. Again, it's kind of a twisted quote here because you can definitely see that there could be some love going on here, but it's dark. Um, you know, it's 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 love without the other person. It's obsession. And this book, I think, is about toxicity. This is about how people don't know the difference between love and possession. And it has a lot that you can apply to relationships now. Are people in love, or do people just want things? Do you love your partner more than you love your car or your house? Um, and and is that true for Kathy and Heathcliff's relationship? Do they actually love each other? They're horrible to each other throughout this novel. I mean, um, and yeah, they're just horrible to each other. And I think that it's interesting. I think that's interesting because Nellie says about Heathcliff's love, and I know she's biased, but if he loved with all of the sorry, if he loved with all the power of his puny being, he could love as much in 80 years as I could in a day. Um, so it's like it's not seen as a love story by the narrator of the story. Like he doesn't love Kathy according to Nellie. Now, obviously, he's biased, or she's biased rather. Um, but I just think this is about a fight for possession. This is Heathcliff is upset that somebody else is going to take away his possession. And I've got one more quote here. You teach me now how cruel you've been, cruel and false. Why did you despise me? Why did you betray your own heart, Kathy? I have not one word of comfort. You deserve this. You've killed yourself. Yes, you may kiss me and cry and wring out my kisses and tears. They blind you. They'll damn you. You loved me. What right have you to leave me? What right, answer me, for the poor fancy you felt for Linton? Because misery and degradation and death and nothing that God or Satan could inflict would have parted us. You or your own will did it. I have not broken your heart, you have broken it, and in breaking it you have broken mine. So much the worse for me that I am strong. Do I want to live? What kind of living would it be when you, O God, would you like to lie with your soul in the grave? Um, Heathcliff is angry at Kathy there, at Catherine there rather. Um, he's, this is not the words of a lover. This is the words of somebody who is angry and mad and betrayed. Um, and and he's going to fight to get her back, but he's not fighting because he likes her. He's been betrayed by her. He's angry. This is this is not a love story. This is a story about toxicity, and about possession, and yeah, it's if it, that it is portrayed as a love story is really quite telling of our society and how problematic our society is. Is it that our society is a little bit simple, or is it that our society is so fucked up that we think that Kathy and Heathcliff, that we think that Catherine and Heathcliff were in love? Um, and then I want to talk about something completely different here. I want to talk about whether Heathcliff is black. Um, when I read this novel, I definitely got the idea that he was black, so I thought I'd do a little bit of research on it, and it turns out that it's actually a topic that people have a bit of interest in, um, and there's a bit of controversy around it. So let's go through some of the facts at the time. So the book is based in 1801, and in 1801, Liverpool, if you remember, Liverpool is where Heathcliff came from, was the centre of the black slave trade in the UK. In fact, the four most common commodities sold in Liverpool at the time were coffee, sugar, chocolate, and slaves. So 3 of those commodities, of course, produced by slaves, and the last one, of course, are slaves. Now, you might think that, well, the Brontes lived quite a secluded life and they may not know about slaves. Of course, if you've read the novel Wuthering Heights, saying that the Brontes lived a secluded life and they might not know about things, well, they clearly lived a secluded life, but they clearly were very cluey on what was going on. In their local school where they were educated, about 3 miles from it was the Still family, and they had many Jamaican slaves working there as part of their sugar business. And indeed, there was a history of slavery in the area. One of the popular historical events of the time was an event called the Haitian Uprising, which took place between 1791 and 1804, which overlaps with the books nicely. Basically, the slaves in Haiti descended on the French slavers, and they had a war and they kicked them out. And it was, it's a quite an important historical event of the time, and quite a shaping historical event of the time. It was well known. It is the equivalent of the Vietnam War or something like that. That sort of event has an effect on our society. Everybody would know about it. Now, one thing about Heathcliff that is interesting is that his name, Heathcliff, is his name. It serves as his first and his last name. And this is very common for slaves at the time to only have one name. In addition to this, the moors where the novel is based is often associated with savages at the time. And the linking of Heathcliff to the moors could be seen as that. And additionally, then Catherine, despite clearly having some feelings for Heathcliff, feels that she can't marry him and marries somebody else instead, in order to gain a bit of prestige. So that's sort of some of the arguments out there. Now, in the book, there are some quotes. I had a peep at the dirty, ragged, black-haired child, big enough to both walk and talk. Indeed, its face looked older than Catherine's, yet when it was set on its feet, it only stared round and repeated over and over again some gibberish that nobody could understand. So, what this sort of says to me is that Heathcliff is talking a different language. So he's come to Liverpool speaking a different language. Now, how do you get to Liverpool speaking a different language? Well, there are 3 theories to this, really. One, he was Welsh, and he came from Wales. 2, he's come aboard a ship. Obviously, Liverpool is a big port city, so there will be people coming in via ships. And then 3, he can't speak, which is a silly theory. So on top of this, it would seem like the Earnshaws were relatively well educated, and that while they may not be able to speak French or Spanish or any of the Romance languages, they may have an ear for it, and they may not have called it gibberish. And this is still coming from Nelle, but if you notice, Nelle has got an education in this and is not a complete uneducated servant. So that sort of says that Heathcliff is from somewhere else. Where that is a question. Interestingly, the Welsh theory, despite that being the language geographically closest to the moors and to Liverpool, that is a language that we would expect everybody to be unfamiliar with. So let's just go through some of these other quotes and see what they mean. He is a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect. This is not the first time he is described as a gypsy. It's not the only time he's described as a gypsy, and it's definitely, there's something interesting here going on. Also, at some point, Nelle says, "If you were a regular black," yeah. He seemed a sullen, patient child, hardened perhaps to ill treatment. He would stand Hidley's blows without winking or shedding a tear, and my pinches moved him only to draw a breath and open his eyes as if nobody had hurt him by accident and nobody was to blame. Now, if we accept that Heathcliff is black, a line like this has interesting connotations, because suddenly, if Heathcliff is the children of a black slave, and we see what Emily Bronte does with children later in this novel and what they mean to their the previous generation, then why wouldn't Emily Bronte be using the same technique to describe the children? What is Emily Bronte saying about slavery here? Well, she's saying that slaves will, accept the beating. Interestingly enough, if you look at how the novel ends, one can say that she says something quite different about long-term slavery and how maybe we should be a bit more careful with how we treat people. I declare he is that strange acquisition my late neighbour made in a journey to Liverpool, a little Lascar or an American or Spanish castaway. So a Lascar was a sailor of Southeast Asia, so somewhere like India, Thailand, that area. And so again, we're seeing a link to a specific part of the world. We've seen him called a gypsy. So gypsies, the Romani people, are of course indigenous to parts of India. We've seen him called a Lascar, again parts of India. And again, we see this again in this quote: "Who knows but your father was Emperor of China and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy up with 1 week's income Wuthering Heights or Thrushcross Grange together." Now, obviously, like a Chinese person and an Indian person look completely different, and you will be able to tell the difference between them. But again, we're linking Heathcliff to this area of the world, and it's quite fascinating that he is linked there so often. It's just like, it's in there a lot if it's not intended to be in there, is what I'm saying. And what I think is really fascinating is if you assume that he is black and you look at how Emily Bronte uses a lot of her literary techniques and how she uses her themes and what you can draw out of this novel, then suddenly this novel goes well beyond being a novel about love, hate, possession, toxicity, revenge, spite, and all of the things that we accept that Wuthering Heights is about. And it also becomes a novel about colonialism and slavery. Now, interestingly, there is a part of this book that is left quite unexplained, and that's when Heathcliff leaves Wuthering Heights. He goes away penniless, and he comes back rich, and it only takes him 3 years. And you wonder what he does in those 3 years to earn his money. Now, one of the things put forward is that he was a soldier, and the other thing is that he was a slave trader, which is quite an interesting twist, that the slave becomes a slave trader. But Emily Bronte doesn't say much about this, and we're just left to guess. All we know that Heathcliff comes back with a slight peculiar accent, so it could be anything. Also, to sort of put the argument against this idea, it's worthwhile noting that Heathcliff's child does not have his dark features, that he has light hair. So is he black or isn't he black? I don't know. I thought that he was when I read it. Looking at the evidence now, I'm not so sure. But if he is black, it just adds just such a lovely level of depth to this novel. And it doesn't really matter whether he's black or not. It's a book. But it matters what you get out of the book. So I think maybe if you reread it, just pretend that he's black and see what you get out of the novel. I think that will add something interesting to this. So lastly, let's talk about whether I enjoyed this. Do I give this, what do I give this on a star rating? So the first time I read this book, years and years ago, I gave it a 1 star because I hated this book. This time, I disagree with that. But do I give it a 5 star or not is the real question. Well, as far as literary analysis and the quality of this book, it should be a 5 star. But as far as my enjoyment of this book goes, it's not a 5 star. I'm only going to give this book 4 stars. I just found myself endlessly frustrated with the narrators. And I can really see why some people hate this book. The characters are insufferably horrible, and I really did struggle with that. I like mean characters. I really enjoy the works of Thomas Hardy, and I like suffering and misery. So I really thought that my criticism of Emily Bronte here is a little bit almost inconsistent with my other views, but I really did struggle to enjoy the characters. The amount of times I just wanted to like dive into the book and throw something at one of the characters is I would have lost count of that. So it is hard to enjoy this book, but if you can get past that, then it's so rich and so detailed, and there is so much. And I really do struggle to think of too many novels pre-Wuthering Heights that have so much accessibility to it and that have lasted as well. Sorry, not accessibility, so much depth to it rather, and have lasted as well. So I really do, if you've not read this book, I really do recommend you picking it up and reading it. But I do recommend that you go to it when you're in a bit more tolerant mood than you would other books, Alright, well, let me know in the comments if you've read Wuthering Heights, what you think. Do you think that Heathcliff is black? I would love to know if anybody has any more thoughts on that topic. If you like this video, like. If you are just watching here and you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. And bye.